Hey, hello and welcome. This is a Facebook Live event called Welcome to Fighting Fake News and Phonies. It's a National Science Week event for 2020 and we're doing things a little bit differently this year. We're taking things all online for National Science Week across Australia because of the pandemic, and the team at That's What I Call Science figured this was probably the best time to talk about the role of social media, the online world, and misinformation, which is probably not a new problem, the spread of false or inaccurate information, but it's definitely a growing issue, and it's been dubbed the infodemic, almost as harmful as COVID-19 itself. So this is an event brought to you by That's What I Call Science, which is a weekly radio show and podcast. You can head to thatscience.org for more of our content. And we've actually got 3 episodes on misinformation to give you more information than what we're going to cover as a panel. I'd like to start today's event with an acknowledgement of country. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm gathering today, the Palawa people. As we record this, I am on Lutruwita, Tasmania Aboriginal land, sea and waterways. On behalf of everyone, I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as the Aboriginal community who continue to care for country. I recognize a history of truth which acknowledges the impacts of invasion and colonization upon Aboriginal people, resulting in the forcible removal from their lands. I stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language, and history, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights, paving the way for a strong future. So I'd also like to start with some disclosures. We've had a number of comments in the lead up to this event, and I've really enjoyed the engagement that we've had online because it's been really diverse. But I'd like to start by acknowledging some of the funding that this event and our show has received. So this event is funded by Inspiring Australia, an Australian government program that supports National Science Week and outreach. That's What I Call Science is a proud volunteer organisation on Edge Radio, so go to edgeradio.org.au to hear more about the community radio that they do. But we have received industry sponsorship from GemMaker, who provide expert advice, services and training to commercialise new knowledge and technologies. And we've also received community grant funding from Hydro Tasmania and the Community Broadcasting Foundation of Australia. Other than that, I'd also like to point out that none of the panelists in today's event have received any direct funding or money to take part in today's event. They're just doing it out of the goodness of their heart because it's an interesting topic that we'd all like to discuss. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, let's get started. So I'd like to begin by introducing our panelists. So we have Dr. Jess Melbourne Thomas, who is a knowledge broker and marine scientist at CSIRO and 2020 Tasmania's Australian of the Year. Hi Jess, thanks for joining. Then we also have Dr. Darren Saunders, Associate Professor in Medicine and regular science communicator on the ABC. He was also the winner of the 2019 Eureka Prize winner for promoting understanding in science. So thanks for joining, Darren.
Hi, Dave.
Hi. I'm also pretty enthusiastic because it seems like every day you tweet something about misinformation. So I feel like this is a topic well up your street.
Yep.
I'd like to introduce Michaela Jade, a Cabrogal woman and founder and chief executive officer of Indigital, Australia's first Indigenous educational tech company specialising in augmented reality use. And lastly, but not least, I'd like to introduce Taylor Griffin, a Gangaloo woman and Boeing engineer and corporate responsibility ambassador, 2018 CSIRO Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Tertiary Student STEM Achievement Award. Thanks everyone for making the time to talk with me tonight and to share what you know about misinformation and your views about the role of science, technology, engineering, and maths, which we'll probably refer to as STEM throughout this conversation, and the role that it plays in the spread of misinformation on the internet. So just to give a little bit of very high-level information before I kick off the questions. Misinformation, what I mean by that is essentially just false or inaccurate information. Examples include rumors, insults, pranks. Some people use pranks or saying that they're joking as a very crafty way of sharing misinformation. Examples can be deliberate, but that tends to refer mostly to disinformation, where it's malicious intent, and that's usually hoaxes or intentionally spreading propaganda. These have recently been coined fake news, so we'll probably refer to it mostly as misinformation or fake news throughout this event. So for our first question, I'd like to start with Michaela. How does misinformation spread and what role does technology play?
Yeah, this is a really massive question. So thanks for picking me to be first on that. Yeah, misinformation it's a really hard thing to categorize, because from the consumer perspective, you don't actually know if it's misinformation sometimes. So when people are hearing things from their trusted networks, they will often share them. And I think that's a result of an intergenerational change between our parents' generation and our generation. So my parents would get their news from the media, like ABC, and they would also get their news and information from the government, who they have a higher degree of trust from than our generation does. And our generation tends to look to friends for information. So if our friends aren't from a scientific background, or are not trained in how to interrogate information, or where to find information, or how to look at it through different lenses, then they will share that, and people will take that as the truth. So I think there's a couple of things. As I'm a scientist, I'm an environmental biologist. I'm also doing a Master of Applied Cybernetics at the moment, so looking at cyber-physical systems. And something that became apparent to me through recent research was how difficult it is to actually get your hands on actual science and interpret that as well. So from an Indigenous community perspective, a lot of that information is located behind a paywall often. And is communicated in language that is scientific in nature or has industry jargon. So it is very difficult for a non-trained person to be able to access the real science and to get the real story and interpret that and then respond that way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's a really important point that you make, that where we go for information has massively changed over the last 20 or 30 years. And you don't get this broad input now that's from journalists who have honed their craft over many years. Now you're kind of slowly introducing yourself into an echo chamber where you're constantly seeing similar views. So it actually becomes really hard to take a couple of steps back, because most of us don't buy a broadsheet newspaper anymore. We get most of it from our social media threads. So Jess, I wonder if you could give us some insight about why do people believe in or listen to misinformation in the first bit? I think, Michaela's kind of touched on it a little bit there about how we're accessing it, but what kind of belief systems make us think that this is credible or believable?
Yeah, so I mean, I actually think that the psychology that underlies why people might believe or listen to misinformation is absolutely fascinating. And I have to admit that it's a little bit peripheral to my field of expertise, but I think it's really important that we understand and think about some of these concepts. And for me, the fascinating part is that these biases, these cognitive biases actually aren't learned. They're to do with the way that our brains are wired. And so, our brains can only deal with a finite amount of information, and too many incoming stimuli can cause kind of information overload. And so our brains use a number of different tricks, right? And these methods are normally in everyday life really effective, but they can become biases when they're applied in the wrong context. And so things like confirmation bias, which I think links really neatly to that concept of an echo chamber, and where we're listening to similar things that we already believe, and that we're more inclined to believe information that aligns with our desires and our beliefs, has really broad implications for the way that people engage with science, with information, and how they might even start to change their behaviours on important issues. There's also important biases within society, and biases that are kind of in the machine, the algorithms that dictate what we see in social media. And so I really think that we need to be thinking about all of this when we consider ways that we might address the causes of misinformation.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, that it's actually the way our brains are wired. And something that I have thought about recently is that this constant 24-hour news cycle is actually extremely difficult to keep up with. So chasing the right information is even harder than normal, because it's this constant onslaught of information. And that's probably been amplified and also encapsulated really nicely in how the pandemic's played out, because there's just swathes of new information coming out all of the time, and it's almost impossible to keep up with for the experts who are employed to do this, let alone for somebody who doesn't have the expert knowledge or the skills to engage with all the jargon heavy stuff. So it's almost really difficult to stay on top of that. And I think you're right that the cognitive bias side, the way that tech manipulates that is really interesting. And it's, yeah, did anybody have anything they wanted to add to some of the reasons why we engage in misinformation or fall victim to it? If not, I will move on to...
I think it's probably just worth pointing out that, especially in the context of a pandemic, that, fear and anxiety is a really big driver of people's behavior as well. And we have also inbuilt biases that make us feel better if we think we know more about a situation, or we know some secret that other people don't. And that tends to bias us towards, buying into some of these things as well. So I think it's kind of important to make that point. We sort of talk about cognitive biases, and we often laugh at people for believing some of this stuff, but I think it's really important to point out that a lot of it comes from genuine fear or genuine anxiety around what's going on.
Yeah, I think another, the perfect example of that for me is 5G. A lot of people will laugh at somebody for being scared of 5G, but actually, if you think about that as somebody who's very removed from the tech, and they hear all of these things that sound, pretty reasonable, it would be very easy to be quite frightened. And I saw that play out on a big scale last year in Ireland. I'm Irish, in case people can't tell from the name and accent. And lots of communities were protesting against 5G masts being installed in their locality. And, they were genuinely afraid for their children, what that would do to property prices, how that would impact them on their day-to-day life. And I think that the worst thing that people could do is be dismissive of that fear and anxiety, because who are we to laugh at somebody over something? That's a completely reasonable thought. So Darren, my next question is actually to you, and it's about what are some of the harms that misinformation poses to individuals or communities?
Oh, geez. I mean, I thought about this question when you told me you were going to ask me this question. I was sort of thinking, where do you even start? I mean, let's start with a really, current relevant example of what's happening with COVID. And, there's a fantastic example of this that came out of Iran, actually, where someone started spreading the rumor that alcohol would be a potential cure for COVID infection. Now, Iran's a country where you're not supposed to drink alcohol. So a lot of people aren't exposed to alcohol. They're not particularly good at limiting their intake. But regardless, people started making their own alcohol and then drinking lots of it. And something like 800 or 900 people have died from alcohol intoxication, trying to treat themselves for COVID or prevent themselves getting COVID. So there's one great example of misinformation going completely out of control. If you think more broadly, the two big ones that always come up are vaccination, and that's incredibly relevant to COVID. And I think we saw that play out today with the way the Russians have been, pimping up their supposed vaccine that nobody knows anything about. There's possibly, I think we need to be very suspicious of what's going on there with that vaccine. And then you could think of any number of examples of drugs that are being trumpeted. So the vaccination thing more generally, vaccination is one of the best medical breakthroughs we've ever had. It's saved more lives than just about anything else you can care to mention. And yet there is still this misinformation out there around it. And then even on a bigger scale, probably again, an existential threat to humanity, which is climate change. And we've seen a deliberate muddying of the waters of the information around climate change by vested interests to try and gain profit, and that's now playing out into political identity and everything else. And it's just become so muddy and so messy that it's almost too easy now for people to, they're almost written the playbook, which they adapted, mind you, from the way that tobacco companies behaved back in the 60s and 70s, trying to muddy the waters around the evidence for tobacco and smoking. So, this sort of thing's been going on for a long time. There's some pretty effective strategies out there that people know how to use now to leverage it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that a real difficult thing about misinformation is that sometimes the harms can seem quite intangible. So we've got real world examples, particularly during COVID-19, if you just look at the surge in Google searches for all things to do with bleach after.
Yeah, it's a great example.
Mentioned it.
Well, not just Google searches, people being admitted to hospital with poisoning.
Yeah.
There was a spike straight after that event.
Yeah, and that's quite on an individual level, but still somehow people feel distanced. But then also, I think the harm that we don't often talk about is actually that the erosion misinformation has achieved of trust in science, in technology, and in public organizations. And I wonder, do you think that that is a new thing, or is that just generic anti-establishment that's kind of always been there?
Honestly, I think that's a bit of a chicken and egg argument. It's hard to pin down exactly which one it is. You know, science and medicine are still overwhelmingly very well trusted. If you look at any of the surveys that are done, scientists and doctors always top out near the very top of the list for most trusted people. But there is no doubt there are elements of society that have been let down by medicine and let down by science, and they feel a deep mistrust. And then I think when you have a situation of fear and rapid spread of so much information coming out like we're in at the moment, it's very easy for that whole thing to get conflated and mixed up, and it sort of takes on a life of its own almost, you know. And so I think trust is part of it, but I don't think trust is all of it. I think it's very hard to attribute what we're seeing purely down to loss of trust. I think, you know, fear and anxiety are also part of it, but I still think we need to be very mindful, and we need to really recognize and actively fight against the fact that there are some very strong vested interests, people making a lot of money out of smashing this kind of misinformation out there, not just the platforms. You know, I saw an estimate the other day that Facebook, for example, have made something like $100 million off advertising related to anti-vaccine sites in the last couple of years. Yeah, so you know, there are a lot of people making a lot of money out of this sort of misinformation. I don't think we should discount the role of that commercial imperative in just people trying to get eyeballs to their websites, you know, to sell them the latest vitamin or cookbook or whatever it is they're trying to sell.
Yeah.
I would absolutely agree with that point that Darren makes, and I think it's really critical that we separate out those issues of motivation versus trust. And in fact, I saw a report that came out just today, I think, or very recently, from the Office of the Chief Scientist, that found that upwards of 60% of scientists actually think that that the COVID pandemic has increased the public trust in scientists. So, you know, I think when it's very important that we treat those issues separately, and that in fact it might be a time at the moment where you know, around the question of trust, we're seeing positive change, but that doesn't take away those other motivations that might be driving misinformation.
Yeah, I think that's true of probably the dominant population, Jess, but I would have to say that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the trust is incredibly low, and there's a lot of structural inequalities around access to information for our peoples.
Yeah, I think that there's quite disparate experiences between different communities. And I wonder, you know, if we were to look at refugee communities compared to really wondered what was the information stream going into the towers in Melbourne and what that experience was. And I mean, I only saw what was coming out on Instagram and things like that, and I was like, that must be a hugely anxiety-inducing experience, but how that would create hesitancy for future information would be a really big concern for me. And I think, you know, Michaela's touched on that Indigenous communities may feel distressful, but we just have to look at, and Darren touched on this, that science hasn't served all communities or all people particularly well. And I think there's a lot of rightful distrust there. So it's a really complex issue. And I think you're right, Jess, that we have to look at motivation and distrust separately, because they're probably separate issues. And I think it's a really good point about corporations making money. When Facebook recently talked about, I don't know if it was Facebook, but people were talking about making money during the election by making points by deliberately spreading misinformation about candidates, that was just happening because essentially social media didn't police any of the accuracy of that information. And I hadn't thought about that they would make money. I figured people were just pouring money into it to score points, but if people are actually making money off sharing it, that's pretty terrifying. So the next thing that we're going to look at is the role of literacy, or how people could be equipped against, to arm themselves against misinformation, and the type of skills that might help somebody navigate encountering misinformation. So Taylor, the next question's for you, and I'd really like to know your thoughts on what role does grassroots or community-based science engagement and education play in equipping people against misinformation?
Yeah, absolutely. So grassroots STEM engagement can play a massive role in misinformation and tackling that. when I read this question, I immediately thought of, like school age students. Lots of young children now have access to social media and other platforms that can be real sort of breeding grounds for misinformation. And we know that, younger people are probably less likely to question the validity of something that they've read or something that they've heard. And so that I think it's really important to encourage early STEM engagement, to provide students with the right education and the right information. Correct science knowledge should be accessible to everyone. It shouldn't matter if you're, in primary school, if you're 7 or if you're 21 or you're 50. And I also think that STEM engagement is really powerful because it allows us, this sort of STEM engagement with students is really powerful because it can allow us to tailor, the information to our delivery of the information to ensure that, it's being understood by those students. Just because you're at primary school doesn't mean you're too young about things like climate change. It just means that the messaging probably needs to be adapted for a younger audience. Children are sponges, so it's really important that we're giving them, the correct information from, STEM professionals and people in the industry. So yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really good points there, and rightly so, about making it engaging and coming from the source to bring it kind of to life a little bit from a really young age. But I also think the role of a scientist going in, or that role model type of thing, it's not necessarily to just be what somebody can aspire to, but it's putting a face to the science. Like, I hated science in school, absolutely loathed it. And I really just didn't enjoy the dry physics classes or get what chemistry was going to apply to. And I just couldn't join the dots. And I just thought it was so dry and boring.
As did I.
I wondered, if somebody had made it a bit more pragmatic about, the harms of misinformation, or how we can decipher knowing if somebody's bullshitting you or not, And
yeah, exactly.
I think that would have gotten me interested as a 14-year-old guy. Oh yeah, I totally want to be able to spot that and understand it.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's really powerful to, be relatable, because if people can't see themselves in you and your story and the messaging that you're giving, then people are just going to switch off. And so I think that's really important.
100%. Darren, I can see you might have something to add.
I was going to sort of reiterate what Taylor was saying there. I think it's that last point there about people are more likely to listen to people that they can relate to and who they feel an affinity to, and who tell stories in ways that they're familiar hearing. And so, having scientists not as these inaccessible kind of weird people, but seeing scientists as humans, including the mistakes that we make and including all of the stuff that we do that isn't science, I think is really, really important, because it helps to build that affinity and that relatability with people. Yeah,
definitely. And I also think, as an early scientist, early in my career, a lot of people seem to be concerned that if you have different dimensions to what you're presenting to the world other than just your science, that you're no longer credible. And I was like, that's the exact opposite. You're probably, if you're just using big words and just talking about your science, to me, you're kind of hiding behind it a little bit. You're a whole person. There's a lot more to you than just what you're researching.
Look, I think that's really important. And I think that criticism you were talking about there is often used as a form of gatekeeping by people who don't really understand communication aspect that well. And it's a way of trying to silence people that talk in a different way to them, or don't quite behave the same way as them, And I feel that as a slightly more senior scientist, that I think it's important to show that, you're a human first before you're a scientist. And there's other stuff to people that are scientists other than just science. I really think that's very important.
Yeah, there's more to us than just writing the next grant. So the next question is for Michaela. I really love what you've done within digital, and I hope that you can maybe give us a little bit of an intro about what it is, because I won't do it justice if I try and explain. But in the context, could you explain it with how we could potentially empower communities to have a voice in tackling misinformation?
Yeah, so In Digital started with a crazy idea that what if we could go to our cultural places and hold our phones up and have a holographic manifestation of our old people sharing the right story at the right time, at the right place, for the right reason. and what if they could get paid for that, and so we could create economies on country. So that's where the kind of genesis of the idea came from, and ended up working through a series of challenges trying to bring this to life in Kakadu. So we built our startup from Kakadu, which was pretty incredible now I think about it in hindsight. So what we ended up doing was trying to find like a product market fit for this cultural work that we were doing, because we wanted to build an economy for First Peoples on country, and we wanted to sustain the company in a way that proves that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can have successful businesses in STEM. So we ended up going into the education market 18 months ago and developing a program called In Digital Schools, where we work both with elders and my team at In Digital to teach kids digital skills through a cultural lens, and it's for all children, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids and non-Aboriginal kids as well. So they get the opportunity to learn about language, land and law from traditional owners, and then they get to translate reinterpretations of that into their own augmented reality experience that they can share with their family. So that's a little about what we do. Why we wanted to use technology is there's a couple of reasons that were really driving me to get involved in this area. So I mentioned I'm an environmental biologist. I wasn't a technologist. So I was a park ranger for 21 years and saw the opportunity and the reasons for shifting this into a technology realm are really important, because we're all in a digital future at the moment. It's not equally distributed, of course. There's 400 million First Peoples that don't have access to a digital future right now, which is terrifying. But we all know about digital economies as well. So what happens to our communities when we don't build digital skills? We can't participate in workforces. We can't participate in shaping things like cyber physical systems. We can't get involved in having agency over our own economies, because they're going to be inevitably digital. So these were the reasons that really drew us to a technology platform to get kids involved in understanding things like Python coding, things like geospatial awareness, and intertwining that with cultural knowledge, language and law.
That's amazing. So just to kind of bring that to life a bit more for me, I'm a really visual person. Yeah. So if I was a kid in one of these workshops or the sessions that you're going to deliver around In Digital, are you going to come in and teach me a little bit of coding, and then, or will I see some of the augmented reality stories that you already have and then use those learnings to create something myself as well?
Yeah, so we teach them how to do 3D character construction, 3D rigging and animation, and then we work through Minecraft. So the kids learn to play through MakeCode. We've also created some repositories on GitHub with our team members, which are really amazing cultural experiences for kids. So they learn how to spawn a Duliga, which is like a hairy man, and they have a hairy man challenge within Minecraft. They learn how to populate the bots in Minecraft with Indigenous languages. So they can ask them the bot function within Minecraft, like, what country am I on? And the bot will respond, I'm on Cabral country, or whatever it is. And the way that we say hello is Wadami. So we build those skills in, then they export a structure block, which is basically a 3D photo of their Minecraft world. They record audio of them speaking language with guidance from the elders, and then our platform uses artificial intelligence to stitch all those assets together into an AR experience, which is done instantaneously. So I guess our first app took 2 years to develop content. We got it down to like a 3-month build for content previous to having a platform, and now it's instant with the platform.
Wow, that's awesome. So I think that what you said earlier, that we're moving towards a digital economy, and it's so many Indigenous communities, but regional, remote and those living below the poverty line don't have access to digital assets the way that most of us frankly take for granted. Yeah. So I wonder, you've made this amazing platform. You've seen the power that it can have when you introduce it to children. I wonder what role you think that those people play in informing how we could tackle misinformation and how we could support them to have access to the assets in the first place? Because I think even when we started this conversation, we kind of assumed, and we talked about the fact that it's mostly spreading on social media, but actually it's also disadvantaging these communities who don't have the same access to social media as the rest of us. So
yeah, not waiting for the internet to come to community is a really great place to start. So we've developed our company in internetless community. So we started learning about other things that we could do, like flying drones and doing 3D photogrammetry mapping of cultural sites, and teaching technology skills in ways that weren't within the context of the internet, but also making people aware of things like deep fake technology. So we do talk about digital intelligence as well as cultural intelligence. So, I mean, I can see the challenges that we're going to face in regional and remote communities with deep fake technology. I mean, you only have to go on to thispersondoesnotexist.com to see how real these representations of people are. And I get to work actually with people that are really immersed in the deep fake world in the US at the moment, and they've bridged like the uncanny valley of these avatars. So it's becoming very real, and discerning what's real and what's not is becoming very, very complex in social media, because you can't tell that it's not a real person. You can't tell it's not them speaking or their voice. And we've already had lots of cases in Australia around like revenge porn and some of the work that's been done around that, because people's images have been used in the pornography sector and spreading misinformation in communities that way. And I've lived in communities where this means like an entire community will mobilize from one community and travel to another, and there'll be like days of violence that occur because someone has put something on Facebook or another social channel where people haven't been able to discern that it wasn't the person actually saying that.
Yeah, wow, that's a pretty real example of the negative impacts that could happen. I think it's amazing just the potential of what you've created to improve accessibility and skills.
Yeah, and we want people to be involved in these industries. You know, the deep fake industry is being built because there's a perceived need for these deep fakes in virtual assistants and all that kind of stuff. And our peoples don't have a place at the table in creating any of those technologies. So how can you understand what the implications are going to be of these technologies that are given a social license to operate in the dominant culture outside the influence of our own peoples?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's if people don't have an opportunity for input, there's no way we can understand the ramifications for communities outside those that are represented. So I think that's a really important point that you make. So Darren, the next question is for you, and it's slightly different to that, but it's around how can those who are working in STEM essentially improve or support STEM literacy in our communities?
Yeah, it's a huge question. You know, that literacy concept is driven by so many different factors. So I think, you know, there's lots of different ways scientists can do it. Obviously, we could all be better at helping people understand not just our own science, but the sort of fundamentals of science. You know, the basic concepts of what science is and how science works. It's a black box to most people. You know, it really is. Even in the stuff that I work in, which is, you know, diseases that are front and center of most people's lives at some point in their life, it's still an entirely black box. You know, and I've had this experience in my own family with diseases I work on. And it was a real eye-opener to me. I just assumed that people would understand what was going on because I understood what was going on. And so I think that's a good starting point, is to work at really making us and our work more relatable, and not doing that as amateurs, but doing that as professionals, doing it as scientists, you know, doing it by relying on evidence. There's really good evidence out there about how to communicate effectively. And I think it's one of the great ironies of, you know, this funny term, science communication. It's, to me, one of the great ironies of science communication that a lot of people doing it, not everybody, but a lot of people doing it are out there telling people, just listen to the science and do things on an evidence base. And in doing that, they're completely ignoring the evidence base around how to effectively communicate. You know, it's kind of almost laughable, you know. And some of the most well-known and famous science public scientists are actually really pretty poor communicators. They're very good at communicating to a certain group of people who are already listening to them. So one thing I'm really big on, and you know, it's a difficult thing to do, but one thing I'm really big on is trying to reach out of the normal bubble of people who would listen to people like us. So not kids who are interested in science, not people who are already interested in science, people who are watching the news and who interact with science every day of their lives, but don't really appreciate that that's what's going on, and just helping them put it in a frame that's more relevant to their lives. And so how do we do that? Well, we do training, and we better understand what works and what doesn't, and we work with the professionals who know how to do it. You know, so with the journalists, with the media, with the professional communications people that we all have in our workplaces. There's lots of different ways to get around that, but it starts with really thinking about who you're trying to talk to and treating it as a conversation, not as a broadcast, not as a kind of, listen to me, I'm a big important scientist, I'm going to try and give you some information and you need to soak it up because I'm important. It's more about a conversation and understanding, why does this person need to know this, or why should they know this, or why do they want to know this, and what are they trying to understand, and why are they trying to understand it, and then helping them through that, rather than just going, right, I'm here, I'm big, I'm important, here comes the information.
Let me bestow this information upon you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's music to my ears. So when we established That's What I Call Science in 2019, it was off the back of taking part in Science Week 2018, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I got to talk to heaps of kids. But I kept finding myself asking, is this reaching anyone that wouldn't otherwise be interested in science? And that's something we continually come back to. If I'm going to organize an event, is this going to reach anybody that is outside my scientific community? And those people, or just my friends on Facebook.
That question keeps me up at night, you know, all the effort that we all do.
Yeah, it's really challenging. And I find it really interesting, particularly with how we communicate on Twitter, the social platforms that we decide to use, the narratives we decide to spin. And the core point there is the accessibility of what we're saying. Just really, who are we saying that for? Is it for ourselves? Who's that event for? Is it so we can say on our CVs that we've done it? And I want to, in a moment, talk a bit more about science as a method rather than science as a fact. But just to kind of push you a little bit further on the accessibility and the expectation, there's a really interesting thing happening in science at the moment where funding and expectations are changing and shifting researchers towards translation. My worry is that what will happen then is people will do tokenistic outreach, and we'll just have more people out in the world who haven't engaged with the journalists or the training, communicating science poorly, and doing things to either put it on their CV, pat themselves on the back, and it's not really reaching outside our own echo chamber of those who are already engaged in science. So I wondered, like, Dan, do you think as a scientific community or as research institutes, is there a role for actually supporting proper translation and communication of science in a bigger way than what's currently happening?
Absolutely, there's a role. I think there's actually a responsibility to do it. I think, you know, we're seeing, you know, there's an example that's in the news today. I won't go into specifics, but there's examples every day I see of sometimes naive, sometimes cynical efforts at communication by scientists that cause all sorts of trouble and make a lot of work for everybody else to try and clean up the mess that they make. You know, we've seen some examples recently of people talking about, oh, I've got this wonder drug, it cures COVID, in a test tube, in some cells. They get all these headlines, and, you know, those kind of headlines have a lot of parents. That, you know, builds up along the chain of information. And most of it, a lot of it is designed at trying to get their hands on some more funding to work on it. Now that's fine, and scientists need funding to do their work. But some of it is done naively, and they're like, oh, I said that thing and suddenly it's blown out of all proportion. Some of it is a bit more cynical. These are people who are kind of seasoned performers. They really know which buttons to press to get themselves on the telly or to get their name in the newspaper. They know which journos to pick up the phone to call. And, you know, one of the things we're seeing now is this pervasion of politics into, I mean, there's always been politics in science, but a lot of the scientific information at the moment is really getting heavily politicized and heavily polarized. And some of that has unfortunately been the result of really poor communication practice by not just the scientists, by the people that are writing the press releases at the institutions and the universities, the journos and everyone down the line. But if scientists, I think, even if they're not with their name out there doing the communication, if they're a little bit more aware of how the communication works, what some of the pitfalls are, and why they're trying to do it, I think it would be a lot more helpful to everybody concerned, especially the people at the end of the chain who are trying to consume the information and make informed decisions, you know, in times of stress and crisis.
Yeah, definitely. And I also think, you know, if we were to look at track record and the proliferation of publishing, and then we've ended up with predatory journals getting scientists to publish, I don't think that really saves anyone. And frankly, as a scientist, it may not reflect well on me, but I don't consider publishing my work the end, like having communicated my work. That's where it goes for maybe some of my peers to read it who are super interested in it. But really, it's when you try and get it past that point. And Jess, the next question is focused on you because you work as a knowledge broker, which is a bit of a new term, but essentially it's what Darren and I are talking about. And this whole panel is kind of about how we facilitate that exchange of information from scientists to others. And I wonder, you know, you're at the interface of climate science and you wrote one of the IPCC chapters or reports?
I was a lead author on one of the recent reports. Yep.
Yeah. You're at that interface where it's really complex science that we're communicating. And what I touched on really briefly before, Darren was referring to, is that science is a bit murky and it's more of a method rather than facts. And I think that if we stick to it being a process that we follow to try and understand things, it's essentially just asking questions, doing some good work and finding answers that we then ridicule and test a bit more. I think that's a good rule book to follow rather than saying this is a fact. But Jess, I wonder, how has that played out for you with taking all of these misconceptions and trying to make it digestible for those who are making decisions and have so many competing interests?
So my head is absolutely buzzing with things to say. It's really been a wonderful conversation. I've been scribbling notes and it may not come out in a very digestible way. I apologise if not, just because I think there's so many interesting and important topics that we're touching on. You know, one thing I would really like to say about, you know, the concept of translation and exchange in relation to knowledge brokering or science communication is that it has to be a two-way thing, right? Because it needs to be delivering the information that is useful to the person that's receiving it. And you can't understand that unless you ask them. And you check that the way that you're delivering it is actually connecting and is meaningful and helpful. And so from, you know, the kind of role that I'm trying to play, that's absolutely a core element, that it is a two-way thing. And I don't think we need to expect that all scientists would be highly engaged in that space. And in fact, if we expect that, and I think this kind of gets at a point that was made before, you know, it's possibly to the detriment of the really important science that is happening. If we make that an expectation for everybody in their individual roles, then they don't have time to actually do the research, which is not a good thing. In relation to how it works in the, you know, in terms of climate change science and how we make assessments that are relevant in the policy making space. When I worked on the IPCC report, I was lucky to be able to contribute to the summary for policymakers that sits right at the top of this, you know, thousands of pages of detailed report. And, you know, there's almost rivers of blood, sweat and tears that go into writing those summaries. I don't know if you've ever tried to read one. They are insanely dry. And I'm not to say that there's not a very robust and well-established and important method that goes into the way that they are put together. But I think, you know, there probably is a need for other ways of connecting some of that information to people that need it. You know, one of the things to comment on is that, and where you talk about science as being a method rather than facts, I think, you know, we can talk about science as a way of knowing, right? And there are many other ways of knowing about the natural world and change in the world. And for instance, the IPCC process, in my view, hasn't yet figured out a way to incorporate some of those other ways of knowing that might, for instance, be Indigenous and traditional owner knowledge and ways of adapting to change. So I think that's really important, and I think that stories can be very, very powerful in connecting those different ways of knowing. And that comes back to that exchange thing, right? That when you tell a story, you tell it in a way that connects with what, you know, what will spark the interest and links to the need of the person that's listening. So that's a very roundabout way and is of answering the question, and is very different from what I had thought I would say originally. But as I say, it's really wonderful to have all these different ideas emerging through the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a really fantastic what you said about that thousands of pages distilled into a short summary and how difficult it is. So have you, other than just producing an end product, you've talked about how that the conversation is a two-way street. And one thing that I think that you said right at the start, which is really important, is that if every scientist was doing this, there'd be a real lack of people, for lack of a better word, in the lab. And that's kind of what I was touching on with Darren. It's like, what's the role here for research institutes or the community as a whole to essentially cough up some money and start paying for us to do this effectively, rather than us bidding for grants to do the work, to find the things, to then try and get the things out there. I think that there's something in the system where, yes, we need to upskill our scientists, but we also need actual expert input from those having conversations. I wonder, how did you, across your career, meander into becoming scientist to knowledge broker? And are you still at all in the lab, or have you solely decided to focus on that exchange of information and having those conversations?
Yeah, it certainly wasn't a kind of directed journey to end up to this point. It was fairly meandering, but there is, I mean, the second element to my role is as a transdisciplinary researcher, which is another term that kind of people don't necessarily know what that means, but it's about transdisciplinary research is research where it doesn't just involve researchers, it also equally involves non-research participants contributing to how we address complex problems, and that's kind of fundamentally dependent on integration in the research process. So I think there's kind of an important field of work where we learn how to do this better, right? So people who might act as knowledge brokers or science communicators on particular pieces of work actually contribute to the greater pool of knowledge about how we do that effectively, particularly given that so many of the problems we face are really urgent ones we don't really have time to dig about anymore, and there's probably not as much space. You know, I think, you know, what people talk about as blue sky science is always going to be important. Without that, we don't have those kind of fundamental discoveries or space for that to happen. But much of our research going into the future, I think, will need to be highly directed towards, you know, addressing needs and addressing the pressing and urgent problems in the world.
Great, thank you. I think that actually touches nicely on our next question. That's for Taylor. We're moving into more so talking about the role of community, and rather than talking, we've talked a little bit about the role of scientists and the science community, but talking more about the role of our organizations and people who are outside of STEM. But Taylor, you're a passionate advocate for engaging in science and engineering. And I wonder, how important to you have mentors and role models been in you kind of, you know, you said you were a bit like me, that you didn't love science to start with. How important was it for you to develop that passion, and how do you think that plays out for communities as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, well, first off, I think it's really important, role models and mentors. It's very important, and they play a really important role, especially if we're, you know, trying to encourage more First Nations people into STEM, which is something that I'm really passionate about. I think that role models can be people that, you know, are doing really well, and just so far just doing really well and doing and exceeding. But they can also be people that are relatable and people that are just, you know, killing it in general. And that goes back to what we were talking about before, is that it's really powerful to have relatable role models, because that's when someone thinks, oh, you know, that story sounds like my story, and, you know, if she can do it, I can do it. And I think that's a really powerful way to really encourage young people to take up STEM. And I think talking about the mentors, that's also important, because, you know, they're offering continual support when you're already on that STEM journey. And I know that in my own story, my mentors have played a really important role in where I'm at now. And I was actually encouraged to apply for the current business that I work in through a mentor. So I wouldn't be where I am today without them. And I think that just in general, when it comes to STEM careers, you know, that term and what falls under the banner of STEM career is just so diverse. There's things that, you know, lots of people probably have never heard of before. And so I think that the more that we can sort of promote role models and mentors that are, you know, STEM professionals and in the industry, can really help to create some really important visibility around what STEM careers are and what they look like, and, you know, the benefits that going into STEM can have for, you know, for yourself, for your community, for your culture, in my case. So I think that's really important. And just the second part, just talking about, you know, the role that they play in getting us to trust science. You know, these are people, role models and mentors are people that we trust, right? So we trust their messaging. And I think that's really important, that when you're looking to step into the STEM space, it's really important to have you know, those people that are industry professionals and academics and just people who know what they're talking about, you know, so that, you want people that obviously know their stuff. So I think that's important as well.
The balance of being credible and relatable. I don't think you want a tall poppy going out to every school who's kicked all the goals, but somebody who's killing it a bit, you know, but still
exactly. And that's just how I think of, you know, my own story. I think I'm incredibly relatable. Like, so I'm just, you know, it's not, you know, it's not so crazy that no one can achieve that. I just think, relatable stories are really important.
Yeah, I agree with you. And definitely what people are doing in science, what an actual career looks like. Michaela, the next question's for you. And I think we've kind of touched on it a little bit with the question earlier, but I'm going to make it a little bit more precise than the one that I sent you, which is, you know, where is the role of technology in controlling the spread of misinformation? So we talked a little bit about how you're using augmented reality within communities. I'm maybe putting you a little bit on the spot, but what is the role of technology in, and feel free others to jump in on this, because I think, Darren, you're also interested in this topic. What role do social media companies or technologies play in helping to stop misinformation?
Yeah, so technology is something that we build, and algorithms are something that we code, which means that there's usually an antidote to making those things. So you can make an algorithm do one thing, and you can make an algorithm that can combat that thing as well. And I think we've seen that in the drone sector. And my sister here would know, if she's working in Boeing, about some of the defensive technologies that are around for things like UAVs and satellite technologies and all sorts of cool stuff. So I think we can, if we can understand it, we can sometimes build something to combat it in the tech space as well. And that's why it's so important that we have diversity in that, because the way that people are impacted by these technologies is not equal. And there needs to be opportunities for people who are like, there was an example the other day that I saw about technologies being used to vet for people for jobs. And the industry was like, yeah, this is great. It saves us human resources, and we don't have to go through and like read 1,000 applications. But it was drilling those candidates down into a very Western, heteronormative kind of pool of candidates. So while people were championing that and saying that's fantastic, there was a whole group of people that this was not a great thing for. Same to do with surveillance, right? Some people are like, yes, we want surveillance because we feel safe if we have surveillance, whereas my community is like, we feel really unsafe if we're being watched all the time, you know. So people have disproportionate impacts of these technologies that we're building. So having people in the sector that understand that means that we can have people in the sector working on some of these solutions. It's really difficult though, because a lot of this is behind like patented technologies and you don't always get to see what's under the hood, especially when people are using like black box technologies where a technology product is served up to you and you just have to like do a little bit of coding to make it look and feel like your product, but you don't really know what's under the hood driving that technology. So it can be difficult to build those. But yeah, having people in the industry to help work on some of the solutions, like if we can make it, I feel like we can unmake it. Yeah, or we can make something that competes with that.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. And I think, you know, a lot of people herald AI as this wonder thing, but actually the data that we're feeding into those are hugely westernized. It's the same problems, we have a lot of similar problems in medical science. A lot of our data is from middle-aged white men. And do you like, Darren, that you are a token man on this panel? But, you know, it is a huge problem. But Darren, I wonder if you wanted to add anything about, we're going to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but I do have another question for Taylor. If you wanted to add about the role of policing the spread of misinformation, and you know, a lot of people would say that's an attack on free speech, but do you think that there's a role for tighter security around technology to stop the spread of harmful information?
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I don't think it helps to frame it as policing the spread of misinformation. I think, you know, getting back to this notion of algorithms and things like that, that, you know, there's some really good examples online, actually, that's really worth having a look at of, I think Ariel Bogle from ABC did a really good example of this, where she set up a burner YouTube or Instagram account and just clicked on a couple of links from sort of wellness influencer type people and really quickly found herself down a total rabbit hole of absolute crap being fed to her. And it just highlights the point that the way we're fed information on these platforms, especially things like Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, relates very heavily to what we've already clicked on. And so there's an amplifier effect going on. If you click on one anti-vaxxer or anti-climate change or whatever video, you're going to be shown a whole lot more of those same videos. And so there's a very, very rapid bubbling kind of thing going on, or wrapping people in bubble wrap going on. And so I think that's a two-way street. Absolutely, the technology platforms have a responsibility here, and they need to be getting better at doing this. I have, you know, very strong feelings about that. But we as individuals and as a community have to get better at doing it as well, you know, and even science, again, back to my earlier point, and I do this myself and a lot of scientists do, in trying to counter misinformation, we often inadvertently amplify and spread the misinformation before we try and counter it. And that includes things like sharing links to crazy videos and things, which just builds the profile of those links in the algorithm, you know. So little things like that, where we take individual responsibility, community responsibility, and then we also need to get these platforms behaving more responsibly. And again, back to this concept of motivation, we need to take away the financial motivation for them to do it. If we take away the financial motivation or put in financial penalties, they'll stop doing it really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like what you were saying about people sharing something to call it out. But actually, if that person is a social media influencer, they're making money of you sharing it.
Absolutely.
You're just increasing their profile and their reach.
But, you know, Instagram has algorithms that can detect a human nipple, right? And block an image. Now, you tell me, if we have technology that can do that, and all of the diversity that exists in pictures and images and the ability to do that, they can't stop simple anti-vaxxer memes being repeated millions of times, or memes about COVID being a, you know, bioweapon escaped, or whatever it is, whatever the current, you know, bullshit of the day is, excuse my language there. You know, the technology exists, it's motivation and willpower that doesn't exist.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you go, Michaela.
I was just going to add that I think maybe we're probably complicit in that, Darren, by being a bit lazy about seeing some of this crap that comes up on our feed and just scrolling past it rather than blocking it and taking active action. I don't know, I'm in the category of when women's ovaries shrivel up and die and need to put their eggs on ice, you know. So I get all these things saying for me to freeze my eggs right now, and I'm just scrolling past that.
Lots of products related to this.
Yeah, I'm not blocking it. I'm too lazy to block it now because so much it comes through. So we're probably complicit in that by not calling it out and not blocking it.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I've gotten to the age where they're now just starting to think about upgrading your life insurance to include fertility. And I'm just like, thank you, Facebook. I'm not sure that I needed that prompt. So I think we've actually, reading the questions that were to come, I think that we've covered most of them. Did anybody have anything they wanted to add before we move to the Q&A from the people who've been watching?
I had a really quick point to make, if
Yeah.
that's okay. That I agree absolutely with all the points that have been made. I think there's a bit of a conundrum in that, many of us use social media not only as an information source but also for escapism, right? From to switch off from the difficult things in the world, and some of the science that we really need to share, particularly around climate change, is not kind of, going to help you relax and get to sleep at night.
Don't really want a dousing of existential dread.
And that's really difficult. So, how do you share those messages without just, people switching off because they're not what they want to hear, and where and how do we actually engage people with hope, even though some of the potential futures that we're looking at are really pretty dire. And I think that's a really difficult and important question that relates to this discussion.
I think that's a really important point to finish on, because Darren actually almost started with that point, that people feel anxious or scared, and then they want some feeling of control. And I feel that way too. When COVID started, all I wanted to do was read everything so that I could kind of have a grip on what was going on. I'm 18,000 kilometers from my folks. They're kind of old, sorry if you're watching. And I was really concerned, and I wanted to know about that. And it was really difficult to decipher what I could trust and what I couldn't. But I think that in a way, we need to just acknowledge that and then try and equip people with what they can do with that information. I think probably, and this is a personal opinion, it's not based on evidence, but one of the worst things that we can do as science is just spout facts at people. It's like, here is my knowledge, this many people are going to die from that disease and it costs us that much money. I don't think that's a very good hook for a lot of people. I think that they would like to know, what can I do now about that information you've just told me? And I think that that's something we don't often do right at the very end, is what can I do with what you've just told me? And on that note, I would like to say that on thatscience.org, we have created a little 4-step guide about how you can spot misinformation, how you can equip yourself on the individual level, and more broadly. And you can also find that on our Facebook page. It's just a little infographic with some of the tips. And then there's also the 3 episodes that we've produced that essentially cover that. But we've had some really excellent questions coming in. We had one during the week, Darren, that's I'm going to direct to you, which is a repeated theme from those that either deny science or have mistrust of science, is that it's privately funded, as in science is privately funded, and that grant competition and research positions essentially cause us to lean towards biased results. And do you think that this is a direct consequence of reduced public funded research?
Look, there's no doubt that the funding squeeze that we're feeling now is playing into the kind of science that's being done. I think we're becoming inherently more conservative in the sort of stuff we try to do. I'm not really clear what the question means about bias. There's definitely a drive within the reward system that professional scientists work within, which is currency of publication, that rewards novelty, and I'm okay with that. I mean, that's what we're here for, is to discover novelty. That does create a little bit of an issue with replication, where people, replicating experiments that others have done, or in some cases not being able to replicate very rarely. That's a bit of an issue with getting that information out there. But I mean, the issue of the funding thing is really important, right? The fact that the source of funding is important for people to know about. So, so many times I see stories in the media around cancer, for example, which is what I work on, where, there's a story about some new wonder drug or some new amazing test that'll detect cancer in everybody under the sun. And when you read through it, there's a really obvious conflict of interest in that somebody is trying to spruik the share price of their biotech company. Somebody has got, something they're trying to get funded, a clinical trial or something like that. And, that is an issue. And that's a really big thing that I help people try and understand when you're, from all the way from my students at university through to, the adults I talk to all the time. Looking for conflicts of interest and understanding conflicts of interest is a really important part of spotting bad science, bad communication of science, and poor reporting, So it's something that we can't ignore. Whether or not it's driving bias, I'm not really sure what the question's asking there, or what kind of bias it would be driving. I think it's definitely a problem that we're losing our intellectual capital because there's not enough funding around. And so as scientists are vacating the space, that space is being filled by other people without the specialized knowledge and without the skills and information to know what proper evidence looks like or to be able to interrogate evidence. I think that's a huge issue. Probably slightly different question, but yeah, that's definitely an issue.
Yeah, I think, potential bias would be, you've touched on there that there's a real push towards publishing novel findings, something that's new and exciting. And a big part that I love about the scientific method is it has to be reproducible. Somebody has to be able to read that clear enough to be able to do it again and find the same thing. And we have a huge problem in medical science of things being shown in animal models. I love the Twitter account of In Mice, of translating that to humans because that's complex, but also the methods are different, but also there's not necessarily, I don't know if bias is the right word, but there's definitely a tendency to only publish positive findings in medical research. So maybe that's what they're touching on, but I'm not sure if that's a direct result of funding.
Look, I think there is. I don't think that's necessarily tied to funding. But I think the important point to make there is that eventually over time, and sometimes over very long time frames, but eventually over time, the correct information or I hate to use the word truth, but let's use that word truth in inverted commas. It eventually floats to the top, so even if there is this bias towards one particular experiment, and we see this all the time in medicine with ideas that have been dogma for decades just get thrown out the door because some new convincing piece of evidence comes along. That is the nature of science. It's in some ways, it's one of the things that makes people sometimes distrust science. Like, well, you told us this and now you're telling us that. What the hell's going on? I thought you guys were interested in finding out the facts. And as we get better at understanding things, the facts sometimes change. The evidence moves and evolves. And we need to evolve our understanding of that. And we're seeing that play out at warp speed at the moment. We're seeing that sort of nature of changing evidence, especially with its impacts on policy, really playing out at the moment. I worry that part of that is actually going to be undermining some people's trust. And there's no doubt that aspect is also being exploited by people with ulterior motives to try and undermine trust. So yeah, that's a difficult aspect of it. Absolutely. So that's one of the things I talk about a lot with people is trying to adapt that more adaptable mindset around as evidence evolves, we need to evolve our thinking and need to evolve our understanding with that.
Yeah, definitely. One of my favorite quotes, I don't know who actually said it, but I know that my lecturer in undergrad used to say it, shout out to Ian Matheson. We used to say that, I think it's from a Harvard professor, that 50% of what we know will be disproved in 10 years time. The trouble is that we don't know which 50%. And I find that really exciting because we're trying to essentially push the dial a little bit more towards understanding what's going on around us. But I did see it as interesting. There was a number of comments on our adverts for this event that said, what's the point? In 100 years time, everything they're talking about will be shown to be wrong anyway, and will have moved so far. So I think that it is an important point that you make, that it's part of the difficulty in trusting it, but actually I think it's the beauty of the
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Uncertainty is an inherent part of science. It's one of those things I wish we could better communicate to people, and if you go all the way back to Karl Popper, if not to get all philosophical about it, but if you buy into Popper's ideas, you can't actually really prove something, you can only disprove it. And so by its very nature, that's the way science progresses.
Yeah, it's a good way of looking at it. So we've had another question come in. It's about tech, so I'm probably going to direct it at you, Michaela. Is technology and access, in brackets, confidence, in using technology, okay, so is technology and access or confidence in using technology to access information causing a social imbalance in trust? So is that accessibility issue causing social imbalances in the amount of trust we have in information?
Yeah, totally. I think it is. I look at the way my parents consume information on the internet compared to the way my brothers and sisters consume it, compared to the way my kids consume it. And I think it also puts pressure on our education system about digital skills and digital intelligence and how we teach that in classrooms, because there's a lot of people that are my age and above teaching in classrooms that don't have confidence in teaching digital intelligence and how to ascertain how to use the programs to ascertain if something's real or not real, or how you build something in tech. So it's kind of playing out not just in where you think it would in regional and remote communities, because a lot of regional and remote communities are actually quite tech savvy because it's their only linkage to the world. So like in towns where I've lived for a long time, you can't even buy underpants in the town. Like you have to get everything online because right? So you become really proficient at internet shopping, for example. So it's like kind of needs driven, but yeah, I think it's in areas where we wouldn't quite expect it, there's a bit of a gap growing. And one of those gaps is in the education sector, where there's such limited time and funds for professional development for teachers in things like digital skills. It's really hard for them to upskill themselves at a pace that keeps them ahead of the game for the kids, because often when we're teaching our program, for example, the teachers won't have ever used the programs that we're using. As soon as they seat them into the classroom environment, the kids have already gone 20 steps ahead of the teacher, and are starting to teach the teacher about some of the processes and platforms and stuff. So I think there's a lot of gaps growing that are kind of silent gaps at the moment that aren't always obvious to us about where the effort needs to lie in building digital skills to help people access information. I mean, even when you want to access journals now, like you still have to go to a library and use a computer to find those journal articles. And if you're not a member of a tertiary institution or you don't pay a ton of money to join the journal, you can't access that. So even just like learning how to use new search engines is like really tricky. I had to learn how to do that this year when I started my master, because I haven't been in the university sector for like 15 years. And now they're like, oh no, we don't do it that way anymore. This is the way that we do it. Even like using referencing tools and all that kind of stuff is tech driven now. And like, even as like a 41-year-old woman, I'm having to like relearn all that stuff myself. So, and I'm being fed that, how to do that in an institution. So if you're not in an institution, if you're not given time or resources to have professional development to upskill yourself, then how are you going to do it?
How, and do you have the need to do it? I think that's a really important point that you say, that it's often needs driven. We use the tech that we need to, and I learn the methods for the research that I need to, for example. Yeah. Thanks for that, Michaela. So we've got another question that I'm going to open it up for somebody to volunteer for. But it's kind of similar. So the question is, curious about the role of the individual on social media. Is it beneficial to argue every piece of fake science or fake news we see posted by our friends? Is linking to actual science on our timelines just going into the echo chamber? What is the best course of action? Who knows, because I have wondered this. I find whenever I try to explain things in my family, they just go, stop being a know-it-all. So it's definitely a challenge. Anybody want to have a crack at that? Darren, I can see you've unmuted.
I have, but I'm doing a lot of talking, so I'm happy for someone else to jump over the top of me. Otherwise, I will start talking.
Yeah, go for it.
I think a really important thing to understand about this is that, there's two really important things to understand about this. One is countering misinformation is really tricky. It's really, really tricky. And if you don't do it right, you can actually inadvertently, solidify those facts in people's minds, those myths in people's minds. So there's lots of good ideas about how to do this. One that I use all the time is a thing called a truth sandwich, where you say, I'm going to tell you the truth about this thing. I'm going to pepper you with this myth, and then I'm going to reinforce the truth again, without inadvertently saying, right, there's this myth and here's this mythical information. I'm going to talk more about this mythical information, and then I'm going to pepper some truth in there. That's not a good way of doing it. I think the other really, really important point, and here I am saying, I think, evidence suggests that people are making decisions and listening to information based as much on belief as they are on fact. And so if somebody's belief system or their psychological biases or whatever it is, makes them feel comfortable about understanding the world in a certain way or believing certain things about the way the world works, you throwing facts at them is not going to change their mind. So you need to put that information in a belief system or in a framework that talks to them specifically. And we've all been talking about this concept. Now, that's a really easy thing for me to say. Doing that is really, really hard. And it gets back to that notion of a conversation, understanding what people are wanting to understand, understanding what they're looking for, and helping them through that. sometimes I think it's actually better not to try and counter things and just to try and let them wither and die on the vine without keeping them alive. It's a really tough one. And I don't know if the ways that I try to do it work that well or not. I think in hindsight, in a few years, we're going to learn a lot out of what's happening at the moment about what works and what doesn't. Saw a great little piece of study the other day that humor is a really effective way of countering
I saw that too.
information, which I think is a really interesting thing to have a look at. And there's some great examples of that in Australia and elsewhere.
Yeah, I just wonder how many scientists are inherently funny.
Not that many.
Or just generally, you know, I'm sure a lot of comedians would tell us that's a learned skill that's even harder than your bog standard communication. So Jess, I can see you've unmuted. Do you have something to add about individuals being brave and tackling misinformation as they see it?
I mean, it's a minor point really, but just to add to what Darren has already said, that I think also if you are an individual making decisions about how far you engage in trying to tackle some of that, part of the decision just comes down to your energy levels, right?
Yeah.
If it's something that you know that you want to be doing and you have the energy to do it, then as long as you're kind of keeping in mind some of the helpful advice that Darren has shared, I think there's nothing wrong with that. But it can be pretty exhausting and disheartening to keep doing that and feel that it's not going anywhere. And so I think there are other ways to invest that energy in probably, you know, in communicating more broadly rather than focusing on one or two people who might be, you know, in your friends list and you're trying to convince to see the world your way. I'm not, you know, I guess there's just decisions to make there about where and how you might make the biggest difference if you want to.
Yeah, I think that's a really smart point. And I was going to add something similar about picking your battles almost, that the question I most often ask myself if I see some misinformation is this harmful and who is it harmful to? Because, for example, a few years ago, some of my friends started to have children and I could see that some of them posting genuine concerns about vaccinations. I was like, okay, that's pretty harmful. I'm going to get in touch with that person. And I didn't want to post on their news feed and say, hey, I just messaged them and I was like, look, I think this is a pretty important point. Love to have a chat with you. And I think that that's what I come back to is how can I do this in a way that doesn't demean them? And is it actually worth my energy and their energy to try and hash this out? Because it is going to take usually a considered conversation. And I think that don't fight every battle. You get pretty tired. We've got another really excellent question. I think, Taylor, I'm going to direct this at you because it's pretty similar to the last question I was going to ask. But the way that it's worded is, we know mentors are important, especially role models who are minorities in science. So people who are women, LGBTQI, or diverse races and ethnicities. So generally women or these underrepresented communities are encouraged to be visible, attend events, mentor, do outreach, talk, represent, be on every panel. So often these people end up having extra workload and the research output could be sacrificed, or they could just, you know, empty their cup. So I wonder, do you have anything that you'd like to add about that, which it doesn't have a question mark at the end, it's more of a comment, but
yeah, no,
the role of mentorship and how, you know, as an Indigenous woman who's the first woman to do the type of engineering that you've done, aerospace, and
the first Indigenous person, so
yeah,
non-gender.
I'm sure you get tapped on the shoulder all the time to do a whole heap of stuff, and you're a STEM ambassador, so people know that you're enthusiastic. How do you cope with that amongst your workload?
Yeah, I think that it's something that I definitely have struggled with early on in my career, because as you know, as a STEM ambassador and someone who's is so keen on encouraging people to take up STEM, I want to say yes to everything. And sometimes back to picking your battles, it's kind of like, well, you know, when I'm looking at things now, you know, panel discussions or events and speaking, I think, you know, is this audience going to get, is my messaging important to this audience? Are they going to get a lot out of it? You know, that kind of thing. It's about weighing up. There's a balance there on, you know, are they just asking me to present on this panel because, you know, I tick a box, or is my opinion, you know, is it going to be respected? So it's really, that part can be really hard. you know, to determine whether you're being invited to something as a token representative or not. So I think that's just something that I'm learning to navigate through my early career. I don't really have a definitive answer. You know, I myself can't tell sometimes I can't tell, you know, when I'm being taken advantage of, and, you know, when my opinion is being taken advantage of, or, you know, when someone is genuinely interested in it. So it's just kind of, I think that'll just come with experience and, you know, learned experience. I think that a lot of other successful Indigenous people, successful women in careers like mine, where those, you know, where those groups are really underrepresented, probably face a lot that sort of same challenge. So yeah, that's just an ongoing battle for me at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for that insight. I wonder, does anybody have anything to add? Like, Jess, you've done a lot on women in STEM and promotion of that, and I wonder if you had any thoughts on, you know, with young children as well, keeping that balance of workload and what you say yes to, particularly as Tasmania's Australian of the Year. I'm sure that you've been invited to a lot of stuff this year.
A lot less than I thought it would be, actually, given the COVID situation, which has been a blessing, isn't it? Had a lot more time at home in the garden with the family, so that's been pretty special. I think, I mean, Taylor makes really excellent comments. Maybe the one thing I'd add is also around in saying yes to those things and becoming more visible, you also become more vulnerable, right? Because you know, once you're someone who is visible across different platforms or in different contexts, you're also someone who can be targeted, and I think there's evidence that that is particularly the case for women. So so there's just kind of, and hopefully that's something that we can work to address, but I think it's a risk, another risk to consider.
That's great. Anything else for somebody to add? Because if not, I've got a bit of a left field question that I'm really keen to see who wants to tackle it. So they've even prefaced with potentially unrelated. Thank you. I know y'all are STEM, but what are your thoughts about the government's ideological attack on the arts? What effect do you think it will have on critical thinking skills, particularly future generations dealing with education? And, you know, we've talked a lot about science literacy skills, but critical thinking, creative thinking, it impacts our innovation. And I can see Michaela's unmuted. So potentially you have some thoughts on defunding the arts and how that will affect overall educational attainment and understanding.
Yeah, I'm a huge advocate for the arts in all its forms. So not just like arts, but dance, like creative technologies. Like a lot of the tech sector is built on science fiction and arts. If people hadn't had the space to imagine some of the things that they imagined even in the 1920s and 30s that we're just realizing today, we wouldn't be where we are today with the technologies that we have available to us. Even just looking into something like cybernetics, like that was born way back in 1920s, even earlier. So to see how long that it takes to have an idea from an arts perspective to then have someone work out all the things that you have to do to bring it into realization takes a really, really long time. And I think people think that arts and the rest of STEM are separate. To me, it's STEAM, and you know, maybe that's a cultural perspective, but I think arts are actually integrated with science. And to me, and I know to my people, like they've never been separate. It's the way that we communicate. It's the way that we express our cultural science. And, you know, there's like a whole dialogue that needs to happen around recognizing our science and as important as Western science. And the way that we've been allowed to express that has traditionally been through art and through art forms. So to see it brought back into the fold and invested in is hugely important to me. And, you know, we're working in a three-dimensional cutting edge technology that needs people with the skills to not just imagine the shape of that technology in the future through expressive arts, but also to be able to conceptually build it. Like you need to think in 3 dimensions. And art allows you to do that. And, you know, that's through our program, for example, we're getting support through people in the space industry, because they see that if Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids can see themselves in a three-dimensional technology, then they're going to make really fantastic engineers, because we're working in like CAD design, and you need that for engineering science, for example. So it's integral, and I'm absolutely devastated with the lack of funds that's stemming to the arts sector. I have like lots and lots of friends that are in the arts sector, and you just need to look at someone as amazing as Lynette Walworth, who can stand there and win a Crystal Award at the World Economic Forum this year and challenge politics and challenge investment in arts as it leads to science. It's phenomenally powerful to be able to help people imagine a future that they can't imagine right now.
Yeah, I can see, Darren, you've unmuted. Do you have something to add to what Michaela said?
Oh, I think Michaela's nailed it really beautifully. I think, art and science aren't two different things. They're different aspects of being human. They're part of the human condition. And, science is an inherently creative process. And so I think a lot of scientists don't appreciate that till they're a long way into being scientists or technologists. It's a deeply creative process. And so we have a lot in common with our brothers and sisters in the arts world. What is the point of us doing all this science to understand the world around us if we then don't have the tools to reflect on what that means for us as humans, or to tell the stories about what it means to be human? And even from a purely pragmatic perspective, some of the most rewarding, most, I would argue, probably impactful, certainly most watched bits of communication I've done around science have been in collaboration with friends and colleagues in the arts sector. Comedians and incredibly clever people who are, their job is to tell stories, and they do it in ways that we just can't even imagine as scientists. There's a great example. I use this all the time when I'm giving talks of it's one of my favorite little bits of communication around disease. It's a fantastic thing that Tim Minchin did with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra about motor neuron disease. And I challenge anyone to find a more effective piece of communication about science than that little song that he did. That's come from the arts. It's telling a story, and it's reaching out into people's emotions, and it's directly relating to them. So, there's no point having science if we don't have the arts. That they go hand in hand. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Jess, I can see you've got something to add.
Oh, yeah, no, just really pleased that this question came up, and I just fundamentally agree with what Michaela and Darren have said. And the only other point that I'd make, I think, is that for me, the most critical thing we can do for future generations now is to help them learn to be problem solvers, right? And only providing them with one way of thinking about problems and finding solutions. Only science is not going to cut it, because we will absolutely need diversity in ways of thinking and diversity in modes of thinking, and just having one or the other is not going to work.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. So last question, we have had more, it's just we've waffled on, which in a good way, but last question. And it relates to what we talked about in our final part, which is telling people what to do or how to act on what we've talked about. So how can people currently working in STEM, be that a scientist or technologists, advocate for the sort of social responsibility we're talking about? So we've talked a lot about the role of scientists and the science community to go out and effectively communicate or tackle information. How could an individual scientist advocate for that kind of work? And okay, Michaela's jumped in there. I was like, I can waffle, but I prefer one of you to talk.
What comes to mind with that question for me is like getting out of our own bubble and actually being in the right channel.
Yeah.
Like a lot of the people that we're trying to reach, like I mentioned before, I'm 41, like I'm on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and all the old people social media, and the kids that we're trying to reach are on like TikTok and Snapchat and all the things. So like getting out of our own bubble and trying to connect with audiences in a way that helps us be relevant to them to start with is a really good step forward.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add to that is that I've been really fortunate since I moved to Tasmania and since I started my PhD to establish a community-based radio show, and that's really taken off. And you know, I was going into my final year of my PhD. My PhD wasn't going very well, actually. I didn't have any data yet. And so I was facing a particularly tough final year. And it's been hugely rewarding. So what I would say is that you can be your own advocate and your own leader for the type of communication you want to be. So I wanted to do something that was values-based, was a team of women, and it was going to talk to mostly an adult audience, because I think outreach is needed in very targeted communities that I don't have the resources to reach. So I would say consider what are your values, who are the people you want to talk to, and then you maybe don't have to advocate in your institute for them to do something. Perhaps you can take individual action on a smaller level that's really enriching, and just think about things that are a little bit different, a bit like what Michaela was saying. Who are you trying to reach? Like, I never thought I would establish a community radio show. I listened to Edge Radio, but I kind of thought they were the cool grungy show. They wouldn't want to have any science, but there's 137 community radio stations across Australia, and I'm sure that they would love to hear from you. But also you can be making infographics. There's a whole raft of things that you could do. And I think the strongest level of being an advocate is to speak through your actions and to do something just in the way that you would like to see things done, do it yourself. And on that note, if anybody doesn't have anything to add, we'll call that a wrap. Thanks so much for joining our event on fighting fake news. It was intentionally provocative. I hope you got something out of it. I'd really like to thank our panelists. You've been absolutely fantastic, and really appreciate you giving up your time on this Wednesday evening to talk with me. It's been an absolute...
Is it Wednesday?
Is it Wednesday? It's Wednesday.
Wednesday.
Thanks so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of Science Week.
Bye, thank you.